Is it 12%? Is it 15%? Is it 20%? Is it by person? Are you having a good day? Were they nice? Were they rude? Were they prompt? How was your food? How do you decide what's appropriate to tip? What is appropriate to tip? Hey, alter ego here. As somebody who works in the service industry as a server and as a bartender, it's kind of a part of my life. A pretty big one. I mean, our financial income, how we support ourselves is a pretty big deal. I talk about that in the adult responsibilities video. But if you're expecting me to sit here and tell you that, like, if you can't tip, you shouldn't go out, I'm not really going to go that way. Because honestly, it's a very negative aspect to take our guests, which in my line of work, our guests is a very fundamental part of that, and their willingness and welcomeness to going out is fundamental in that as well. And if they just simply assume that the only thing we're working for is the tips, then why aren't we just making that and that's being calculated into the food? Because it's not. And I personally like the fact that it's a variable, optional kind of thing. Let's throw some other things in this conversation to maybe help you understand a little bit more. And maybe you do. So minimum wage for a tip-based position is actually just over $2. It's about $2.33, I believe. So the people who are working as your server or your bartender in many occasions, they aren't working for minimum wage. They're working for less than minimum wage. Minimum wage is essentially, as a society funded backing our government, have decided, like, that's the lowest amount that somebody should work for. Below that, it's considered almost inhumane. So why is it okay? Because we get tips, which ends up pushing our minimum, not our minimum wage, but ends up pushing our income up, which is why we declare our tips. And if we don't make enough to make up minimum wage, those companies have to make that up. But here's the thing. If you aren't making those minimum percentages on your sales that should be getting you enough money to make your minimum wage, then most companies will view that as you're doing a poor job. So if you continuously receive less than a certain amount, many businesses will view that as your poor service, and it can be grounds for termination. Now, granted, this will rarely end up in the firing of someone who is doing a good job, but if you start having a lot of people who think it's okay to not tip, like, that's going to cause a lot more issues. Tips are given for a service rendered. For example, when I'm working, I also happen to do the to-goes while I'm bartending, so I have to run out to people's cars. I have to take phone orders. So maybe I'm taking a phone order, and it's for a lot of different people. I have to get the names for each and every one of those. I have to present every one of those checks separately so they can be paid for separately. I have to bag them all up. I have to make sure there are all the different things like to-go silverware, napkins, ketchup, any things that they need. And then when it comes to processing, like, I have to stop everything else that I'm doing. I can't be a bartender at the moment because I'm tethered to the phone. And so it becomes very frustrating for me when not making minimum wage even, and yet for them to not tip, it's sort of saying that the service that I rendered, which was in fact above and beyond what is typically called for of me, was worthless. Now, in the end, I continue on my merry, and I can't let it just ruin my day. But it's hard to be disrespected in that manner, and especially because a lot of times people don't necessarily know that that's the case. There are definitely a lot of different to-go type positions where, like, you might go out to a car to take someone their food, and you're not making minimum wage, and that person doesn't know that you don't make minimum wage, that technically a tip is supposed to be included. So it's not necessarily ill will, and it's also a lot of misunderstanding. So how much should you tip? Honestly, between 15 to 20% is a pretty good amount. Because on those wages, a person can make an okay amount and get by working in the service industry, which is all that we ask of most of the industries. The only difference in the service industry is that the guests are much more a part of the wages and the income of the people working in it, trying to give you a much more symbiotic link where, like, as the service person, you need to make sure that you're making them happy, and they kind of should be treating you while making you happy, otherwise you're going to give them terrible service. It holds both people accountable. And also remember, because servers work for such a low wage, it does make your food cheaper as well, because that doesn't go into the cost of figuring out what they sell. So in all, these are my thoughts about tipping and the like. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. Let me know in the comments. But this has been Alter Ego. Trot on, everyone.